things they happened yesterday. There was a quick swearing in of a president to the southeast of Kenya, and we are entering into that conversation at this time. Two distinguished gentlemen are in the hot seat this morning. Kwamchetsi Makokha is here. He is a member of the Kenya Human Rights Commission Board. He's here again after years. Kwamchetsi, good morning.
Good morning, Du.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you so much for coming. Let's chambua this kidogo, shall we? And also, a very good friend of ours, Dr. Nicodemus Minde, is a researcher with the Institute for Security Studies. He's here with us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning to you. How are you doing?
Very well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good that you can come to the Situation Room this morning. Of course, both of you well versed in these areas that we speak of, and then also looking into regional politics, but then also being able to say what's in it for the people of East Africa. So we'll have that conversation. But Dennis wants to welcome you with today's proverb.
Today we're in Mauritania, and we are in a country that is rich with iron ore, gold, copper, and fish. And it is also a country that banned, the last country in the world actually to ban slavery. But then again, some tendencies of slavery still exist in this country. But this great country gives us the proverb: a tree that grows crooked will never be straightened. A tree that grows crooked will never be straightened. Kwamchetsi, you're laughing. How would you interpret that?
That is, it's a damning statement. It's like you've given up on something. This has gone wrong. It's gone bad. You'll never mend it. It's a very dire proverb.
How would you interpret it?
Well, of course, I think most of these proverbs tend to transcend borders. And for instance, in Tanzania, we always say, of course, even here in Kenya, samaki mkunje angali mbichi. I think this is just, it just mirrors what that Mauritanian proverb is talking about, that a bent tree can never be straightened. So, samaki mkunje angali mbichi. Of course, you can say maybe even for a kid growing up, you need to really discipline him before things go sour. Yeah.
Before things go sour, indeed. All right. So, last week, Wednesday, Tanzanians went to the polls on the 29th of October. Before that, there were quite a number of calls for protests. But the protest was, number one, against the sham election. So they said, don't go out and vote. But there was a protest to what many, from what we understand, Tanzanians called, unjust rule, unjust administration of the Samia Suluhu administration, that electoral reforms had not taken place. And there was a whole litany of issues that people brought to the fore. They said, because of that, on this day when you go to the polls, we are protesting against some things. In the subsequent days, from reports which are unconfirmed in totality at the moment, we're looking at about 1,000 people dead and scores injured as a result of these protests. And then a day after that had been collated, we were told that 97.8% of the vote had gone to Samia Suluhu, and that she, by the commission, had then been pronounced as the winner of the election and then president. She was then sworn in a very enclosed ceremony yesterday at a military base in Dodoma, which was then secluded from members of the public, with certain dignitaries in tow, with a number of presidents, two of which gave their speeches yesterday. She was then, of course, she was given the instruments of power, and she then made a speech, and in half an hour after that, tops, the ceremony was over, and everybody wiped their hands and went back to business as usual. No? Kwamchetsi? This is what happened in Tanzania. It sounds like a lot, but just 5 days, 6 days. It's not a week since the election. The people went to the polls, but it seems to have been dusted, and the lives of the 1,000 people who protested seem to have been forgotten already.
I will borrow the English from the Tanzania Election Watch report of 2020, which basically said that there was no election in 2020. There was also no election in Tanzania in 2025. So it would be wrong for us to even begin to discuss the election. There was no election. Yeah, there was an administrative event. It was made to look like an election, but there was no election. Who was voting? If there were all these disturbances, people were protesting, people had been barred from contesting, and of course you go and look for some sort of unknown people and you line them up on the ballot paper and say these are the people contesting. So it was a sort of election where Samia Suluhu was running against herself, and I think cartoonists and everybody has made a meal out of that. But it's similar to what John Pombe Magufuli did in 2020, which is that he made sure that first of all there was, and I think it starts with CCM. Where there is no nomination. I think the earliest indication that you get in Tanzania that there's going to be an election is the competition for the CCM ticket. And in 2020, there was no competition for the CCM ticket. And that was carried forward into the so-called election, which was a non-election. A similar event occurred in 2025, and Samia, who is Magufuli's inheritor, basically just she took out whatever finesse that Magufuli had attempted to use in rigging or swearing himself back into power. She just took it out and she just showed the naked brutal fist of the Tanzanian state in terms of saying we have power and we are going to use it. And I listened also to her speech yesterday and I felt very sad. I felt very sad because there was nothing about people's voice. There was nothing about sovereignty of the people. There was nothing about people. There was everything about stability and security. And I that was a bit frightening as an East African. And I say this because in other places I've also said this, that Tanzania has provided the soul for the East African community. Tanzania is the crucible. That's where we go when we are looking for Utu, Ujamaa, when we want to be more humane. When we want to be a more humane society, we look to Tanzania. And it's not just East Africa. This influence, if you follow even the liberation movement, Tanzania and Mwalimu incubated the African National Congress, which ultimately ended up, of course, running South Africa. How they ran it, of course, is another matter. But all those liberation movements, Frelimo, right up to Angola, all that is this Utu, Ubuntu, all of it, the philosophy of it finds a home. The source is Tanzania. So when Tanzania gets destroyed, when there's decay, when there's democratic decay, as we have seen, I think in the past 10 years, we are tempted to look at last week. But in my view, this decay has been running for the past 10 years, and we are just beginning to feel the stench.
Nicodemus, we look at a situation where the president was declared president-elect by having been voted in by over 30 million individuals, right? And these are Tanzanians who came out and voted for her. But when it comes to your swearing in, these 30 million people locked out of this ceremony that was given credence by the 30 million. What does that speak of?
I think it speaks of, first of all, issues to do with legitimacy. Of course, it's a legitimacy crisis. Elections are meant to renew legitimacy. Elections are an opportunity to renew accountability. And elections are, of course, a part of nation making, because it should be participatory. It is about putting into account the leaders that you have elected. And as my colleague Kwamchetsi has mentioned, this election was nothing but a sham of an election. We saw it from the word go. I termed it as a coronation exercise because the nature in which the nomination really proceeded. If you look at, I was in Tanzania during this election, it's as if there are posters of the president everywhere. So I really wonder what was so much of importance that she really had to campaign this much again in the wake of we don't have any formal opposition. The leader of opposition is in jail facing treason charges. Even the closest challenger was disqualified, and of course the 16 others, you saw them yesterday at the swearing in. Just that tells you something about the whole electoral process. But I want to reiterate something very critical, as Kwamchetsi has mentioned. The protests were just a culmination of years of anger and grievances that have been, bottled in by Tanzanians. And of course, this protest and the election really debunked some of the myths about Tanzanian people. I think there was a repeated lie. I think that Tanzanians are timid. Tanzanians cannot protest, and I think it was something that was said again and again, and it almost became like a truth. But again, the truth is, human beings are wired to survive, and you cannot just say that people are timid. I'm glad that this also is happening within the context of an African youth awakening, and also an attempt to really reorganize the state, which is happening in many African countries. If you look at the past 3 elections, Tanzania, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, you can just see a general trend that there's a dissatisfaction of the electorate, and the electorate are demanding to be heard. And I'm afraid what is happening in Tanzania is a government that is not listening to the people.
What do you make of the statement made by the president during her speech that those who are demonstrating in the country are imports, are not Tanzanians?
I think that is another, for me, I think that is another insult to the people of Tanzania. While, in fact, do you want to make the fact that Tanzanians cannot protest and Tanzanians cannot rise and speak against a government? Again, it's just symbolic of the nature of government repression that that silences every voice of dissent. And I think it is also just an attempt to really, to pass the blame to other people, or to just discredit the agency that Tanzania is now rediscovering.
I think it just infantilizes the population, unfortunately. But if we just look at it with a cold eye, is that Tanzania is actually the most populous member of the East African community. So it is not possible for populations to overrun Tanzania. It's not possible. It's not physically, logistically possible, because Kenya has a smaller population, Uganda has a smaller population, Somalia has a smaller population, DRC, of course, is probably bigger, but it's buffered by Rwanda and DRC. So who are these foreigners who crossed over from all these borders to come and do protests in Tanzania? I mean, some of these things are laughable.
And remain there for days.
Yeah, but can't we read between the lines? She's spoken of Kenya before. And on social media, there were claims that there are Kenyans who actually were going to the border and wanted to get into Tanzania. And we know the activities on the social media platforms, especially from the Kenyan side, encouraging the protesters that, fight for your country, fight for your democracy, fight for your own space. And so, isn't she making that statement coming from somewhere? And you can clearly see where she's pointing at.
I would like to sympathize with Samia. But you see, you also have to understand where East Africa is located and where our countries are located. If you look, there is a sort of very colonial division around Bisil, that place where we share a mountain, the Kilimanjaro. The communities are, they just keep on crossing. That thing is... That borderline is nonsense to them. The communities around Mwanza and around the lake, they fish right across, and they just interact. And so same with Serare and the border and Isebania. So the first thing is that you cannot wink in the dark and imagine that, there's no one and there's no one who's going to notice what you are doing, because, this is internal to Tanzania. Tanzania is the business. Tanzania is the business of couriers who have relatives in Kenya and in Tanzania. Tanzania is the business of Maasais who have relatives in Kenya and in Tanzania. Tanzania is a business of Kenyans who are in Nyanza and in the lake region of so it's we have to be able to understand it, I think, and not use reductionist arguments in terms of this is insulated. The Tanzania is a mishmash of communities and peoples, and we have interests in there, and you cannot close it off as Samia is trying to do. Yeah, you can't close it off and say this is our business and we're going to do it. No, it is our business.
So even when we listen to what somebody says, usually they say the art of listening is then to be able to find treasure in the things that somebody does not say, and they're saying it just as loudly, right? So when she said the things that she said, perhaps the person who kind of said them for her was Hakainde Hichilema in what he said before she spoke. He spoke after Evariste of Burundi, and these are some of the things that he said. And then maybe we can hear what that message is, because it was very interesting to listen to him. He said, and he spoke... he called his own long journey to opposition politics. He recalled his journey in Zambia, and he said, our political party in Zambia was in opposition for 33 years. I led the movement for 15 years and lost the election. He stressed the principle of peace, and he said, I remained firm that I could not take our men and women on the streets, as their blood would be on my head. I repeat, I remained firm that I could not take our men and women on the streets, as their blood would be on my head. He then made an appeal to Tanzania to preserve peace, and he said, today we are privileged to lead our country. We inherited a peaceful country. This was after his fight for almost 40 years. And we have to leave a peaceful country to the generation to come into peace. That is my call to the brothers of Tanzania. He said a number of other things, but those were just so poignant in the way in which he put this message out there, remembering that Hichilema was in jail for many things, and many can be likened to what Tundu Lissu faces today. And this is a president who is saying, basically, guys, many say he is the one who gave the speech that Samia Suluhu should have given.
Well, without a doubt, and that message was quite, as you put it, poignant, but also hard-hitting, but also indirect. I don't know the reason why the Tanzanian government actually, invited him, and probably they did, not knowing that he's going to really speak what he said. Of course, Hichilema, Zambia has a long history with Tanzania. You can understand the reason for his invitation, but the words that he spoke were really, hard hitting, but also very, straight to the point, in the sense that by him speaking about his long journey in the opposition, by him also speaking about the issues of peace. I always say that most of our countries have peace. What they don't have is justice. And Tanzania has enjoyed this peace for a long period, what we call probably negative peace. What Tanzania really needs at the moment is justice. And what the protesters are actually demanding, or were demanding, is the prospects for justice, is the prospects for reforms in the electoral architecture of the country, is about a new constitution, is about a release of prisoners, is about the abducted people and critics. It's about enforced disappearances and many other electoral malpractices. So the message that was being passed by Hichilema, although being it subtly, was very important in terms of a reflection for Tanzania, and I hope it will be a good message for the president, for President Samia, to really use that as a point of reflection.
Kwamchetsi, you earlier said when Magufuli took over power, it wasn't an election. The two previous elections, this one for Samia Suluhu also was not an election. You said it was an administrative what?
It's an administrative event.
Administrative event.
Like Mashujad.
So,
Yeah.
if that's the background, then why are we having this conversation anyway? Why then are we speaking like we expected something different with this election? If in the past, this is what they've always done. The reason I say that is because then explain to me, well, we know the presidential vote. She won like 99% of the votes. Then you're looking at now the parliamentary seats. So CCM has won 270 MP seats out of 272.
Right.
So, so explain if this is the presidential vote that we are discussing here. But then let's go to let's look at the parliamentary setup, and this is what we seem to be having. It's a clear majority, 270 out of 272.
No. It's not a majority. It's a hegemony. It's a hegemony.
Yes.
CCM has, I think, in my view, it has mismanaged Tanzania because when the multi-party wind came in 1990, Tanzania pretended to allow multi-party, but what CCM actually did was to sponsor a few individuals to set up opposition parties. There was no opposition in Tanzania. This is the first time, when you see Chadema, it's probably the first time that Tanzania is beginning to experience an opposition. And an opposition is a party that can challenge the government for power. Previously, NCCR, Mageuzi, all those, when you actually begin to look at it, and I have the benefit, I've sort of had the privilege to look at a lot of the material around Tanzania. And these were former CCM cadres who were sent. They were sent to go and establish opposition parties for purposes of appearing to be multi-party. And so CCM never transitioned from the single party mentality of having monopoly and hegemony of power. And where we are right now, and I just connect that with what HH was saying, is that we are now at a moment where Kenya was in 2007, where something in Tanzania must give. The reason I'm saying that is not to frighten anybody, but Tanzania has been attempting to do a constitutional review for at least 20 years, formally. Yeah, it started when Kikwete was president.
2010, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that conversation has been renewed and abandoned over a very long period of time. And some of the things that then we are discussing are, why is it not possible to challenge a presidential election in court?
Right.
Once the Electoral Commission has made, and when you look at the numbers that you are talking about, those numbers are ridiculous. How can you have the number of people voting, I think, exceeds the number of registered voters? Right? So some of those things, I mean, how do you count? Kenya was struggling. Kenya was struggling to count for 14 million votes over a week. Tanzania, with internet shutdown, no communication, in a period of 3 days, had managed to count 31 million votes. Kiswahili must be a very fluent language, to be able to count all these millions. But let me come back to this thing that, Dennis, you are raising, which is the Africa Peer Review Mechanism report. Yeah, of about, I think, Nicholas, it must be 2018.
Yeah.
Yes, 2018. This is where African heads of state come and agree. You have a problem here. Try and fix it before it becomes a crisis.
Right.
And the APRM is usually a very good predictor of a country's governance issues. We had one in Kenya, and they warned of certain things. We didn't pay attention to them. We ended up with post-election violence, 2008. In Tanzania, again, APRM went there, did an assessment, pointed out all those issues that are now coming to the surface now, almost like more than 10 years ago. And by the time now we are coming to have this conversation where Tundu Lissu is saying we are sitting out this election because it is not an election. We're sitting out this election because it is not an election. It means that there has to be a conversation about how you get citizen agency and citizen voice into the organs of government. And CCM is not able to do it because it's too greedy. I mean, how do you win 270 out of 272 seats in a multi-party democracy? Surely even 13, when they used to do it and they used to have like 12, 13, 14, 15 and so on, the previous parliament, the Magufuli parliament that Suluhu inherited, the CCM is nominated for the opposition all the women representatives. I mean, how absurd is that? Yeah, like, the ruling party comes and picks the members of the opposition who are actually going to sit in parliament to represent women. You're just cannibalizing the system. There's no belief in democracy in CCM anymore, and there has to be a conversation. And I think HH, speaking as he did, he was doing that thing that we do at funerals. You start indicating when somebody has died, like for example, if I die, people start holding up their hand and say, who's going to look after the widow? Yeah. So what HH was saying is that I'm actually open to start negotiations for how Tanzanians begin to talk to each other and have a conversation about their country moving forward.
But even when we talk about Tanzanians having discussion with each other, you see, any leadership in a democracy, it is the people donating their power to a few individuals to pretty much just govern and make sure the country runs, right? But here we're talking about an exercise that took place and people's voices have been scuttled. So at this point, one asks the question, who exactly will President Suluhu be leading? Because the people have said no.
And I think that's an important question you're asking, Dennis, because the logic, the CCM, and I keep on going back to this, the CCM logic is that the people are not important. The party is more important than the people. And that is the conversation that Tanzanians must have. Because at some point, when we are doing Azimio, when they were doing Azimio la Umoja, the party was more important than the individual, right? And that's a conversation that Tanzanians must revisit and say, are we still 1977? Yeah, when we did the Azimio la Umoja, are we still there or have we moved? Because the citizen of 1977 is not the citizen of 2025. And the things that they saw or they needed to do at that time, the state, security, all these things that Samia is talking about were probably important. The citizen, the Tanzanian, the East African, the African of 2025 has a completely different view of their place in this world and so that's why these conversations that we are having about sovereignty being donated is a slightly different iteration of the kind of democracy that Tanzania chose to pursue. And it chose to pursue one where you have sort of village committees and they talk into structures. They talk into party structures. So if the party structure is actually faithful to that logic, then you produce and CCM remember when this guy ran I think it must have been against Kikwete very, very convincingly. And I think there was a 50% split in the election. Even Magufuli. CCM was still had the pulse of the country. Now, that is actually not there anymore. So something has happened and the top has isolated itself from the people. So whatever form it is, whatever shape and form self-expression is taking in Tanzania is such that ordinary people don't have voice in their government.
Okay, and so on that point, because that's what we're talking about, that there can be peace, but there cannot really be peace if there's no justice. And when we look at the protests that happened in Kenya, especially, let's look, earlier on, July, and we look after that, and when activists who went to Tanzania to actually be in solidarity with Tundu Lissu, some of them were sent back. Some of them, unfortunately, then had been abducted and tortured. And the response that Samia Suluhu gave essentially is that we do not want this bad behavior that is characteristic of Kenya to stain Tanzania's image. That's what she said. and she was very clear on that. She alluded to more or less the same thing yesterday. And like we said, I mean, look, you're going to wrap a bicycle in wrapping paper. It's going to be very clear that it's a bicycle that you're giving as a gift.
Yeah.
So she basically is telling you that this thing that Kenya has been able to do where you protest all over the place, we don't want it here. She's alluded to the fact, to her belief, that the people who were arrested in Tanzania over the protests, or the people who came to cause the mayhem, are not Tanzanians. You said that's an insult, Nicodemus. But beyond that, she still believes, like I know we say, when somebody says something, believe what they're saying. She believes that the people of Tanzania are taking on that element of docility that you say is not the case.
Yeah.
But she believes that the people of Tanzania will be meek in nature, and they will listen to what they're told, and they will do what they seem to love. That's what she believes. She wouldn't imagine for the slightest that the people of Tanzania are fed up because 10 years of an unfurling of a system is happening before our very eyes. But she is far removed from that reality, and she's going to lead for the next 4 years.
Yeah. That's the tragedy that we are experiencing right now in the country. And as Dennis was asking, what was this if we are saying it's not an election? In academic terms, we call that electoral authoritarianism, where you conduct elections in authoritarian contexts. Of course, it's like a misnomer, and most of African countries have done that excellently. And, elections need to give you certain meanings in terms of the choices people make, for example, and most of these have actually been robbed from these people. For example, elections, the number of people who did not turn up to vote is an indicator. So people use that to measure certain things. For example, in 2022, for example, Kenya says that about 8 million did not vote. All right. And then they say the protests of the 2024 protests, in fact, statistics are showing probably it is those 8 million that are now rising to protest. So again, if you look at the Tanzanian elections, all those variables that can be used to interpret an election have been taken away from them. So they cannot even be able to make meaning out of these elections. So when you tell them that 97% of the you've won by 98%, and that the voter turnout was 87%, yet we all know that the election was disrupted at around 11 a.m. and that there were protesters. So you cannot, let alone just to make sense of an election in terms of interpreting the election. What did this election really, what did they mean for these people? And now, even for these protests, you want to diminish them or just suppress them. Again, it's not worth it.
But does she believe that the people, do you think that she really believes that the people of Tanzania did not come out in protest? Because if she believes that, then there's a problem that they don't actually protesting against any of this.
No. I think she's much more intelligent than that, but she wants to have her cake and eat it.
Yeah.
Tanzania is a security state. Without sounding condescending, which is that you cannot go to Tanzania from my very early days when I went to gather poetry in Tanzania in 1998. You don't show up in Tanzania and people don't know what you are doing.
Oh yeah, they know in a very short while you're there.
It is not possible. My experience and the experiences of very many other people is that you don't sneak around in Tanzania. In Tanzania, everybody is in your business. So how is it possible that you are running a security state, as Tanzania is doing, and then you actually have this infiltration of, in Songwe, Mbeya, Mtwara, all these regions, like at least half of the regions, Tanzania was overrun by East Africans? That is nonsense. So you either are running a security state, or you are being overrun. So which is which?
But Kwamchetsi, isn't this a familiar script? And I'm just sitting here thinking, wait a minute, there's something that we're missing here. Samia, you don't expect, obviously, with all the intelligence, that she doesn't know what's happening. By the time because they started off by switching off the internet for Dar es Salaam first, then later on it starts going now to the other parts of Tanzania. Now, what she said is, what happened does not reflect our character, tradition, and aspirations as Tanzania. It is not Utanzania. It wasn't a surprise that some of those young people who were arrested for participating in violence, including foreigners, what you're referring to. Now, our defense and security organs are continuing to investigate these incidents to return Tanzania to the peace we are accustomed to. That's what she said. And then she vowed to safeguard Tanzania's peace and sovereignty by all means and at all costs. And I'm just reflecting on these words. We've had these words even here in Kenya, where time and time again we keep hearing politicians say, tunataka tuungane tuwe pamoja kama wa Kenya. Then you sit back, who is fighting who? In my neighborhood, I'm not fighting with my neighbor. My neighbor is not fighting me. What is this constant reference everywhere they go, talking about tunataka tuwe na umoja, tuwe kitu kimoja? In Tanzania, this is exactly what she's saying, that tuwe na amani. Isn't
patriotism.
Yes. Isn't this a familiar script that, fine, allow chaos and violence, people will die. Then use that for the next 5 years as your rallying point, that, look, I'm here to make sure that we are united. But you already know what you've done, and you know what you're doing. Isn't this what's happening? In Kenya?
I'm happy we are on SpiceFM, because you are one of the stations that create narratives, and the narratives is how we explain ourselves. To ourselves and to others. And these stories that we're hearing is an attempt to run ahead. Because I think there's going to be a reckoning in Tanzania. There's going to be a justice reckoning in Tanzania. And part of that reckoning is part of the things that the people who are on the ground, human rights monitors on the ground, have actually said, is that the people who are also perpetrating the violence were not necessarily jeshi la wananchi la kitaifa la wananchi. They were actually people from Burundi, they were people from Uganda, some of them might have even been from Kenya. So the state outsourced the violence to foreigners. And this is not the first time it has happened. It happened in 2020. So what we are hearing is that Samia Suluhu is running ahead of that script by saying they were foreigners. She's the one who brought in the foreigners. But she's running ahead of the script by saying they were foreigners who were actually causing problems. Yes, they were foreigners, but they were dressed in fatigues, and they were the ones actually who were quelling. Because a lot of when you look at Nico is a security expert. When you look at the numbers. When you look at the numbers in terms of the Tanzania forces, if you had a confrontation between the standing army and the reserve and the police vis-a-vis the population in Tanzania, is a no contest. Because the numbers just don't add up.
Kwamchetsi, you talk about the foreigners who've been outsourced, and you talk about Burundi, Kenya, and Uganda, what you're now gathering. And one would sit and look at when citizens of Tanzania were being shot on the streets, you realize how leaders in the region are just quiet, just watching what is happening. Yet we belong in Jumuiya, Africa Mashariki. And one would have hoped that all these presidents would have had something to say with regard to what is happening.
Our president is the chair of the
summit. And you look at, even at the African Union, the chairperson himself was the first to congratulate Samia Suluhu for winning the election. And you look at that and one would say, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, same script, abductions, torture has become the order of the day. Are we surprised that these leaders were quiet to just see people being butchered on the streets of Tanzania?
In fact, I have a terminology for that. I call it authoritarian solidarity. Actually, if you look at what the silences of Kenya, for example, or Uganda, is authoritarian solidarity. In exchange, that Tanzania will also do the same when it comes to when it's Kenyan stand or Uganda stand. But I want to really contextualize Tanzanian society from what what Nyerere really built, and what Dennis was inferring to as this Tanzania patriotism. Tanzania is an imagined community. It was a national building project that really imagined the Tanzanian people, and that is why Kwamchetsi will maybe wonders why there's this a perceived resentment of the external, which is sometimes used to consolidate the internal. And it has worked for the ruling party, where you build these sentiments, internal sentiments, against an imagined external threat. And of course, many countries also use that to consolidate some form of community or patriotism or nationalism. But again, it is important to look at that again, as Kwamchetsi was saying, these things are changing. So the Tanzania of Nyerere has evolved. It is evolving to a new society. And I think what CCM does not realize is that evolution is quickly taking shape, and it needs to really rework. And I don't look at CCM in isolation. I look at CCM in relation to many of these so-called African liberation movements or African liberation parties. Look at ANC. Look at what it now is being forced into a power sharing government with the DA in South Africa. Look at what Frelimo has done. It went also to post-election violence in Mozambique. SWAPO the same. ZANU PF the same. So you can see some form of a trend, and I think CCM probably has realized this, or they are blind to this. But I think it is very important to understand that historical context to really situate Tanzania's current position. Yeah.
So it could have been imagery or symbolism, but the 16 challengers, 16?
Yes.
70?
There were 17, but there were 16 at the inauguration yesterday, Abi. And during the inauguration, I think it was very interesting that the Master of Ceremonies called each and every one of them, recognized their parties, and asked them to essentially stand and address the crowd, for however big the crowd was. What significance would that play? That this Chama Pinduzi is recognizing these are the guys who were not going to give a chance in daylight.
Let me just give you some form of context.
What
There's
would that
16
be?
candidates. So once you're cleared to run for the president, the Independent Electoral Commission gives you a vehicle, a car.
Yes.
2 vehicles. And most of these guys go up and say that they thank the president, yet they're the same people contesting with the president. So you can imagine, again, this is just, this was state-sponsored.
So wait, who gives out the vehicles?
The NEC, and then the candidates, Electoral Commission
gives the presidential candidates vehicles
to campaign. And the presidential candidates thank the president and the government. And you want to say they are going to mount any serious challenge? Not at all. All this, and I'm telling you this from insider information, all these fringe political parties are state projects.
That makes sense now.
They are state projects.
Okay.
Yeah. And most of them have either defected from this main opposition party, Chadema, because it has refused to
Be part of this.
Yeah, of course.
Kwamchetsi, is there something we also maybe missing? I was reading something somewhere, and internally, the politics of Tanzania and Zanzibar. So when John Pombe Magufuli died, so it created then a problem. Now his deputy was Samia Suluhu, who was from Zanzibar. And then the story is that it was agreed, okay, fine, that power will be handed over to the PM because the Tanzanian president should not be from Zanzibar but from mainland.
Yes.
Because Mwalimu Julius Nyerere then assured Tanganyikans that the union with Zanzibar would always reserve the presidency for one from mainland. Zanzibar was to have their own president, government, parliament, judiciary, even their own electoral commission, which they have. Zanzibar was also to send MPs to the Bunge la Muungano in Dodoma. Now, when Magufuli died, then you have Samia Suluhu, who is from Zanzibar.
Right.
Now, this election happens that she is the front runner from CCM. It's the first election she's actually then contesting and winning, okay? Winning in quotes. She's from Zanzibar. Now, Tundu Lissu was obviously going to win the election, according to what observers are saying. So the voters were saying that Zanzibar then had colonized Tanganyika, and they're asking themselves how Zanzibar can have two presidents and Tanganyika to have none. Is this going to be a problem beyond what else we're discussing?
Right.
She's from Zanzibar. Now in Tanganyika they're saying, okay, fine, we have two presidents from Zanzibar. Does it matter?
It does. It's a big thing, and part of the deal that Nyerere brokered to bring the union of Tanganyika and Zanzibar was that it killed over. Tanganyika basically, Nyerere decided to be the bigger person. Zanzibar, even in terms of landmass and population, is actually really, really small. But in terms of how it is treated as a state. It's semi-autonomous, it has its own government, and there's a lot of grace that is extended towards Zanzibar. But Zanzibar has voice. It has voice and also culture. But there are a lot of people now, when you sort of get into that conversation about democracy and numbers, then mainland tends to feel that sometimes they don't have as much voice. And that is why then that is sorted out at the party level. And that is, if you take this back, it's a little older than Magufuli,
yes.
Because you remember Ali Hassan Mwinyi deputized Nyerere, right? And so it is to him that Nyerere passed the mantle. So he ended up being president of Tanzania.
Yeah.
So that story is not quite.
For me, let me just explain the union issue, because I think it is most times misunderstood. So there's an unwritten rule in Tanzania that there is some form of rotation of the president from a Christian to a Muslim. But again, in the political structure of Tanzania, a presidential candidate who is from the mainland will pick a vice presidential candidate from Zanzibar. And this is part of balances of the union, trying to bring about this union question into form of stability. You talk about the question of Tanganyika being colonized by Zanzibar, but this has often that conversation has always been that Zanzibar has been a colony of Tanganyika. But what we also see now with the rise of Samia, there is now a new conversation about the possible return of Tanganyika, which people believe was lost. In fact, at one point, the former president in Zanzibar, called the first president, Karume, used to say, Tanzania imevaa koti la muungano. So you can understand that complexity, and that is why I'm hearing from the Kenyan social media spaces about some form of broad-based government or a handshake. I think that is impossible in Tanzania because of the political structure of Tanzania, which does not allow that or does not conceive that possibility. So we need to really understand the union complexities.
It's much more complex.
Yeah.
Is it true, though, that there's the rotation that's understood between Zanzibar and Tanganyika, that the mainland was going to supply a president, and the deputy would come from Zanzibar.
Correct.
With the death of John Pombe Magufuli, that meant that you didn't have a mainland president, but you had a vice president that was Zanzibari.
Yes.
Constitutionally, the vice president would take over. She happens to be Zanzibari.
Yes.
It is said, and looking for your confirmation, that the person who negotiated this move to allow the constitution take place was one former president, Jakaya Kikwete, who came in and said, you know what, constitutionally, even though she's Zanzibari, allow her to come in as president, which would topple the apple cart in terms of what had always been happening. If that's the case, would it in any way contribute to the simmerings of any kind of pressure that we see then now coming to the surface?
In fact, the thing that is often has been missed is all this that is happening right now could be internal party politic dynamics, that even the protests themselves have an element of disquiet within the system. that in fact the way and the manner in which Samia was nominated for this seat in to run for the president really contravened party traditions in the sense that it was important that she's subjected to a formal nomination. And as Kwamchetsi was saying, and I agree, that Tanzania's democracy has always benefited from CCM democracy. Of course, we have to be awake to the reality that Tanzania has this historic hegemonic party that is the CCM, and in one way or the other, this is what shapes Tanzanian political trajectories. That if CCM really nominates a person, the likelihood of that person becoming president are very high. So it is from that CCM really needs to understand that its internal party democracy has an effect,
very big effect,
on Tanzania's democracy. And the deterioration of Tanzania's democracy currently, as Kwamchetsi, you have put it very well, is as a result of declining internal party democracy within CCM, in the manner in which, for example, how Magufuli was nominated in 2015. He was not the most popular candidate. The party contravened most of its rules and bypassed the popular candidates. And of course, what they're saying is Tanzania is now paying the price for that.
Yet, in all this conversation, there is a name that keeps popping up. So, like you've said, John Pombe Magufuli was not the preferred candidate.
Yeah.
In fact, they say his sudden rise to stardom, quote unquote, surprised many, even within the party, even the party ranks, accidental. Then in comes Samia Suluhu again by the support of this name, Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete. And my question is, Samia wouldn't, and that's just an assumption, you have to have somebody who's really backing you up or supporting you up or telling you, go for this, don't stop. In this case, who's really behind the power? Is it Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete who's pulling the strings behind the scenes?
I think
from the party level?
Yes, I think that's a good question, Dennis, because we have to look at the people who've always sort of been, they're called Vigogo, the pillars, the pillars of the party. So the late Hassan Mwinyi was one of them, the late Mkapa when he was alive. So all those former presidents, they just brought so much gravitas. And when the meeting, and I remember the Nyerere when he was alive, brought corruption smack into the nomination room at CCM and said, there's a very, very popular candidate. This, I forget his name.
Lowassa?
Yes, Lowassa. Lowassa was looking like he was actually like gonna win, and he ended up, of course, defecting and running and not winning. But Nyerere, I think, was at that time, he was like, we want to know, where have you got your wealth from? And that became the issue. So the thing about the elders in CCM, those are very important people that I think need to be watched. But those are the people I think we might be making a mistake by focusing on Samia Suluhu Hassan. Yeah, we could be making a very, very serious analytical error in focusing on the individual. Because I think my own hypothesis is that the elders of the party told Samia Suluhu Hassan, you are not electable. You are not electable. So two options. A, you are going to step down. I think that conversation happened sometime, I think 2-3 years ago. You are going to step down.
Or toe the line.
And allow us to pick somebody else. Or if you insist on running to be president, you must allow us to deliver the victory in the manner that we want. And the reason I say that, twofold. When Tundu Lissu had been shot 16 times and was recuperating here in Nairobi, it is Samia Suluhu Hassan who visited him.
Indeed.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. She has held a meeting with him outside.
In Brussels.
In Brussels. She has pardoned. She pardoned Freeman Mbowe, and even has organized for the return of some of his confiscated property. So she was going to be this conciliatory president up until some point. She repaired a lot of the damage that Magufuli had done. And somewhere midpoint, she abandoned all that and she became a completely different creature. And we must then go back and ask, so what is then impelling her to become this vicious person? As we speak, my phone is basically still burning because I have colleagues, Kenya Human Rights Commission works, is a Kenyan NGO, yes, but it works nationally, regionally, and continentally, and even internationally. I have colleagues out there who are saying there are people who are being secretly, hurriedly buried, right? In Tanzania, as we speak, people are still being hunted down and captured, and a lot of them young people. This thing that we are talking about, foreigners, a lot of people are still being followed, captured, detained. And what is that? That cannot be Samia. That is a system. CCM is that system.
They call it Mtandao.
Yes, it's a network. And it's bigger than government. CCM is bigger than the government.
You make it sound like the mafia, Kwamchetsi.
Yeah.
It's worse than the mafia.
So
It's very well organized. Yes.
Nick, you mentioned that deterioration of democracy in CCM directly translates to deterioration of democracy in Tanzania.
Yeah.
But as we look at that Tanzania that many have thought has always been docile in the region is now rising up and speaking.
Yeah.
Is this perhaps a turning point for Tanzania where the citizens are saying it is no longer about CCM.
Yeah.
It is about what we want. We want a democracy as enshrined in the constitution, or what the word means. We want justice in the country, and we want meaningful change. Is that what Tanzanians are now speaking to CCM and the leadership in Tanzania?
Without a doubt, historians will tell you that countries have moments, historical moments, where they either make a leap forward or they go back to square one. And I think Tanzania is at this particular moment where for the first time that a people would come out and protest. And this is probably where Kenya was in 1992, for example, or the 1986 moment in Uganda, whichever you want to call it, that Tanzania is in a moment in which it has to really deliberate its future. And how do they go about it? How should they go about it? I think it is very important that the conversation around a new constitution begin as soon as possible, because every pronouncement that the president has mentioned in terms of the 4 R's, that is her philosophy of reconciliation, resilience, rebuilding, and reforms, they do not have any institutional anchorage. So it is just her word against the rest. So I think it is important to have national conversation. And national conversation sometimes is where you speak the bitter truths, all right, which will involve all stakeholders, and ask critical questions. Why? Where are these people who have been abducted 2 years missing, or enforced disappearances? Where are the legs of Mdude Nyagali? Where are the legs of Soka? What this treason charge against Lisu? What about Heche, who was taken by just before the election? And this is a serious conversation that the government really has to have, because it is an important period. If at all, if not, I think Tanzania has reached that point we call them the adolescent period, in which now that innocence has now been broken. Yeah.
This conversation continues because the sentiments are rife, not just in the region, but then going towards SADC, to in the southern part of the continent, and then globally. That you have all sorts of conversations going, that if you don't look at the back end of this, like both of you have so well synchronized for us this morning, that it's very easy to talk about one woman and her contribution to this, and maybe it's not just her. Now, even as we do that, the questions are that why is everybody so concerned and commenting about what's happening in Tanzania, especially from a Kenyan perspective? It may seem obvious, but there are those who need to hear it to understand that. Why do you want to have a conversation with other countries with whom you share positions with in a bloc, where you're your citizens cross over borders, like you so well explained, that you are part of REX together, that you form part of these African countries whereby you want to do something together. Why is it important that we look into the intrigues of this conversation?
Let me just begin where you sort of started, which is that Samia's run has given women in leadership a bad rap.
Unfortunately.
But you see, we also miss the other important part. I know wonderful, excellent Tanzanian women leaders. Fatuma Karume, the former Tanzania Law Society president.
Yes.
Maria Sarungi, say hi. And Manasseh Ahmed, and many, many others. There are many rising women who are offering leadership that is alternative, that's different, that's outside of the mold of what we are seeing. Why is Tanzania important? Tanzania is culturally over-influential. Tanzania has basically forced all of us to accept that Kiswahili is, a formal language at the African Union. They have stuck there. Now South Africa has even adopted it. It's now being taught in school. But for those who are Catholic, our worship is, I would say, 60-70% Tanzanian songs. Bongo is a big influence. And when you see what Tanzanians are also beginning also to do with the networked communication environment, online and culture and society and so on, and just how we conduct ourselves, Tanzanians appeal to our better angels. They actually tell us how to behave, how to be African. And so, when you are looking at your source of inspiration going to seed, it's a very, very worrying thing. Tanzania incubated the idea of African unity. That was Nyerere and Nkrumah. So this thing that we are doing in Addis, this thing that we are doing as a REC, it could very easily just come apart. This free trade that we are talking about, these open skies, all the things, all the possibilities, because the things that were not possible for people in my generation, our children will demand them as rights. They are not privileges. Children, or rather not even children, even adults right now who are getting out of high school, they don't want to be confined to a job in Kenya. They want to be able to work in Senegal, to cross over the continent, and the world is their stage. And so we can't be doing this navel gazing. And what usually happens, if you look at the way that our elections, we signal each other. What happened in what happens in Kenya influences what happens in Uganda and Tanzania. And when you look at the elections the way they are arranged, Tanzania goes first, then Uganda is next year, then Kenya is the year after. So the pathologies that we are observing in Tanzania is actually almost like a pretest. If you allow it to stand, you are actually saying it's going to be confirmed in Uganda and then it will be perfected in Kenya. And we can't stand for that sort of situation.
To stand for it. What does Tanzania look like going into the future? Nicodemus, as you talk, and the future is tomorrow. The future is next month. What does it look like?
The future is currently a bit bleak because I think it is important to have national conversation. The events of the past week have really wounded many people. We have relatives, brothers and sisters, parents who have really been hurt by what has happened. And these injuries need to be healed. They need to be discussed. They need to be resolved. And these are grievances that need to be discussed. Tanzania was, this is not the Tanzania of Mwalimu. And I think in search of that return of Tanzania of Mwalimu, really, as my colleague Kwamchetsi says, Tanzania needs to soul search again. And by soul searching, you can be able to find answers in terms of creating a better society, which I think we are in a slippery slope that Samia really needs to come in and help resolve.
It's been most enlightening to then be able to see the intrigues behind the scenes of everything that's happening, to get a better understanding of what's going on, and then to be able to help us have better and deeper discourse. And both of you have helped us do that wonderfully this morning. Kwamchetsi Makokha is a member of the Kenya Human Rights Commission Board, and Dr. Nicodemus Minde is a researcher with the Institute for Security Studies. Gentlemen, both, thank you very much. It's a hope for the better for tomorrow, for sure.
Thank you for
you very
having
much.
us.
Thank you for being here.
You're wonderful people.
Asante sana.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.